On this episode of the Sports Opinions Podcast, I talked to orthopedic surgeon and author Jonathan Gelber about his brand new book coming out in October, Tiger Woods' Back and Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies that Transform Careers, Sports, and Society. We also touch on the current state of the MMA and some of his favorite guys, and New York sports and some of his favorite sports memories from his time growing up. And without any further ado, cue the intro. What's up, sports fans, and welcome to the Sports Opinions Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Alex Cuesta, and with me today is someone that definitely is involved in the sports world in a different way. He's an orthopedic surgeon who is currently on his way to moving to Rochester, Minnesota, and he's the author of Tiger Woods' Back and Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies that Transform Career, Sports, and Society, and that's a book you can get in October. Jonathan Gelber. Jonathan, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, I had the privilege of getting an early copy of this book, and I have to say, if you are a fan of sports at all, this is something that you need to grab. It is a fantastic read. I flew through it. I'm not the fastest reader, but I absolutely flew through this book. Jonathan, you did great work here. I got to give you a compliment on that.
Well, thanks. It actually means a lot to hear that from you, and I appreciate it.
So a little background on the book. The title kind of explains it all. He's an orthopedic surgeon, so he likes to look at it from the medical side. And he's giving you kind of the correlation of how some of these major injuries in sports, and some of these are stories from the past that maybe our parents would know, our parents' parents, but they're all relative and how they get relative into actual society.
Mm-hmm. So, first we'll talk a little bit about the Cobra effect. So this is an idea. It's been used to describe economics. It's been used to describe, a lot of different things in society. And basically, it relates to this story that takes place in Imperial India. And at the time, there was an overrun of snakes, mostly cobras. So the town decided it needed to do something to get rid of these snakes. So what they did was they put a bounty on snakeskins. And the story goes that when, the village people brought in the snakeskins, they would be paid a bounty. So the more snakeskins you brought, the more you got paid. So the snakeskins started to come in through the basket load, and they were giving out bounties left and right. But pretty soon, people noticed that the snake population wasn't changed. The number of cobras stayed the same. So something was not right. So after some careful investigation, what the government officials found was that there were people actually farming the snakes. So they would farm the cobras rather than go out and hunt the wild cobras. And they would raise them, they would kill them, they would skin them, they would bring in the skins for reward. And this process continued for quite some time until obviously the officials discovered this and put an end to the bounty program. Well, when the farmers of the snakes had nowhere else to sell their snakes, they let them free. So you had a massive influx of farmed cobras back into the wild. So if you looked at the snake population, what was meant to reduce the snake population actually had the opposite effect, an unintended and opposite effect of raising the snake population. And so that's where the Cobra effect comes in. It's this idea that you might have a well-meaning plan or a well-meaning reaction, but you might actually have an unintended consequence. And not only will you have an unintended consequence, but actually might end up making the problem worse than when you started.
And I think we just see this a lot in life. And I think we see it a lot in our own lives where, like you said, we have a problem. We think that we have a pretty solid solution to fix it, and it ends up just compounding the problem. And one of the cool parts about the way you used the Cobra effect is you talk about exactly what you just said in the introduction of the book, which was a good intro into it. But unlike a lot of other books, you don't just kind of leave it on the back burner. You use this at the beginning of each chapter, which is awesome, bringing another real world story throughout history to then introduce your connection to sport. So just quickly, what was your inspiration for writing it that way and using the Cobra effect and doing this book in general?
So my inspiration was to tell the stories of these athletes, but not to tell it in the same manner that we've heard before. Many people are familiar with these athlete stories, and they think they know how they end, but actually, as we found out, the effects are much broader than what we initially thought. And my idea was to present a new take on things, sort of a Malcolm Gladwell approach, where we take a story, and he likes to use David and Goliath as an example. And in that story, we all think we know the story about how David beat Goliath. But in his book, he says, okay, well, there's some evidence here that maybe Goliath couldn't see well. And maybe the problem was Goliath couldn't see. So now you're looking at something and you say, that's interesting. Let me go back and look at that. And all of a sudden you have evidence for a new narrative. And I really wanted to do that with these sports injuries. And so that's why I came up with centering each chapter around the Cobra effect, but not just the original story. As you mentioned, each chapter begins with a non-sports example. Some of my favorite ones are actually the starlings. So starlings are these birds that we wouldn't know much about them except for a man who is a Shakespeare fan. And so starlings actually are a bird in Shakespeare. They take place in one certain act. And so this pharmacist, he wanted to add Shakespeare's birds to North America. So he released about 60 of them in Central Park. And they actually survived, and they multiplied, and they multiplied, and they multiplied. And pretty soon they were numbering in the thousands and then the millions. And today we actually have a starling problem. They've actually caused plane crashes. They cause millions of dollars in damage, all because of this simple idea that, okay, I'm going to release some starlings and we're going to have a very simple effect. And in fact, you end up with this large, dramatic, unintended consequence. And so I use that among other stories to learn a lesson, to teach a lesson, that we can all see that there are certain effects or nuances of this Cobra effect, and then how that relates to a sports story and what we can then learn from that sports story using that original non-sports story as reference.
And it's a bunch of great stories like that that kind of keep you hooked, and it makes you definitely want to go through the rest of the chapter and see, all right, how does this relate to sport? How do I get this connection? What am I going? And then you get more information. And I got to say, this book is not a super difficult read. There's not a million technical medical terms. It's a simple book, read and understand. And you talk about some major athletes like Sandy Koufax, Magic Johnson, Dale Earnhardt, Tom Brady, Tiger Woods. But you talk about some other athletes that are known, but maybe a little lesser known or forgotten, like Lyle Alzado, Len Bias, Hank Gathers, Dale Lloyd, Duk Kim, and you bring these stories back into light. Now, out of all the stories that you covered in this sports-wise, which one was your favorite to do the research on?
So I would say two of them really stuck out in my mind. Now, the Tommy John one I think is a very important chapter, and that's why I led with that. But as an orthopedic surgeon, I was well aware of the consequences and the problems in society following the surgery. So for me, while that was a story I like to tell, it wasn't anything new for me. What I found interesting was looking back at Magic Johnson. Now, what we talk about in the book is the announcement of Magic Johnson's HIV status had on testing. And it's very interesting that I could go back and look at the medical literature and actually see published papers looking at the effect that Magic Johnson's announcement had on testing rates of different ethnic groups, of different genders or sexes. And because people were collecting data at the time, they could go back and look and say, okay, here's month 3, here's month 4, month 5, Magic makes his announcement. What happens in month 6 and month 7? So that was very interesting. And you could see which groups actually had the greatest impact. And so that was interesting that I could actually go back and look at that. The one that I found most fascinating was Len Bias. I had known the story of Len Bias, but I didn't know how far-reaching it was. And I think of all of the stories that are told in the book, the Len Bias one perhaps is the most relevant today because it relates directly to our drug laws and to our prison system. And it's something that even Barack Obama's presidency had to amend, and even the current administration has a First Step Act whose sole intention is to retroactively, or looking back, change the sentences of people who were convicted under these drug laws that were a direct reaction to Len Bias's overdose with cocaine.
Now, fun thing about every single chapter and every single thing you talk about is it all connects back to either not only law, but certain things in society that were changed, maybe unbeknownst to people, but because of these things, society definitely changed. So they had a major impact on everything that was going on. One of the chapters that stuck out to me is when I was younger, I liked NASCAR more than I do now. I don't follow it as much. I don't have a driver, but I clearly remember the day that Dale Earnhardt died. I was watching that race, clearly remember it. And then I remember the flood and the car of tomorrow. And I have to tell you, Jonathan, just reading and reminiscing about the car of tomorrow just made my blood boil. I hated that car, hated that style of racing. And honestly, when you were talking about the effects of people being turned off by the sport because of it, I was one of those people that were kind of like, there were certain times where I needed to sit around and I would base my Sundays off of football and then switching back to the race, football and race. Once that happened, I was so much less interested in the race. And just the effects of, like you said, the Cobra effect of meaning so well and going so far. And like you said, today NASCAR is still trying to wrestle and figure out ways to get back to its popularity that it once had.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of a well-intended reaction. So you had Dale Earnhardt's death, and NASCAR naturally wanted to find a way to make things safer. But their unilateral approach to transforming the car and not discussing things with the engineers, the drivers, the designers resulted in the debacle of the car of tomorrow. And that's in contrast to, I think, how F1 did their reaction to Ayrton Senna. And I use Ayrton Senna as an example to contrast with Dale Earnhardt, is after Ayrton's death, the drivers got together, and the drivers and the designers and the engineers and the people who ran the organization, they got together. And what ended up happening was not something that took away viewership, not anything that pissed off drivers necessarily, but it was something that made the sport safer. And so that's a parallel where you can see, okay, you have two big name drivers. They both die on a racetrack. How are we going to react? And so the lesson learned there is you can't make these unilateral decisions, although they are well-intentioned. You have to talk to the other parties involved. That's a perfect example. And that chapter as well is interesting because Dale Earnhardt's death actually affected privacy laws. So that's something in my research I came across, is that not only did Len Bias have laws named after him, there's a group of laws or a singular law, depending on how you look at it, called the Len Bias laws. Well, actually, Florida created a Dale Earnhardt privacy law directly in response to the autopsy photos and attempts to find out how Dale died. So this is even greater reaction beyond just the car of tomorrow. We have actual laws in courtrooms that have been affected by Dale Earnhardt's death.
I feel like you could teach a college course on literally what you did in your book in sports and society and the effects of certain injuries and things on sports and society. And I could sit here, Jonathan, and do this whole entire podcast going chapter by chapter, talking about every little part of it. But I really want people to go out and read your book and buy it in October. So I don't want to spoil it for everyone. They just get the gist of it through a whole podcast.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. But there are tons of stories to tell. And, as you mentioned, each chapter has a non-sports story. So even for the non-sports fans, they'll find that interesting. And then each chapter itself will divulge into other related athletes as well. So, one chapter might begin with Hank Gathers, but, a few paragraphs later, we're talking about Chris Bosch and athlete decision. And so there's a lot of stories that intertwine within each chapter. And so while on the cover you may say it's just about Tiger Woods and Tommy John, in fact, it's much, much deeper and much broader than that.
Yeah, and there is absolutely a ton of information in this book, but it is super easy to digest. So anyone that's going to read this, I know a lot of sports fans, a bunch of us are probably like, oh, we're not book readers. I'm telling you right now, this book, it has a lot of information, but it's good information and it's very easy to take in and to digest. And it's a great read. It'll keep you locked in and you can literally get done reading like a chapter a night. And this book would be fun knowledge to have just in general. Now I have to ask you, ultimately, what is your message? What is your goal for putting this book out?
So the purpose of this book is, one, to see how sports relates to society in general, that it's not just happening on the field. This is actually something that intertwines with our culture and our society. But beyond that, what can we learn from all of these things? And so each chapter is sort of a lesson. It's sort of a lesson to remind ourselves, to make sure we have the right information, to make sure that we're looking at things from the right perspective, to make sure that we're not overreacting or even underreacting. So, we're not robots, we're not computers, we are human. These reactions are very human, but sometimes we need to take a step back and make sure that we're doing everything we can to try and limit these biases. And from there, make the best informed decision that hopefully has far-reaching positive consequences and not these unintended and or opposite consequences that we've seen in the book.
Definitely. And again, I'll give you guys the title. It is Tiger Woods' Back, Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies That Transformed Careers, Sports, and Society. What is the exact date that people can get that, Jonathan?
So it'll be out October 1st, and it should be available at Barnes & Noble. It's available on Amazon, and of course, your local book dealer. If they don't have it, you can request it, and they'll be able to buy it from Skyhorse or Simon & Schuster publishers.
So it's less than a month away. Mark it on your calendars. Definitely go out and get it. One interesting thing is you happen to be an MMA guy. You've written another book about MMA, and you have told me and already professed to me your love for MMA. Right now, UFC is big. It is a big-time sport. It is a moneymaker on pay-per-view. It has competition. UFC has competition with Bellator. UFC is king. What do you feel is the state of the sport right now?
So the state of the sport is interesting. So it's obviously at the pinnacle it's ever been, because I've seen the sport evolve from the early days of Royce Gracie, which is when I actually got into jiu-jitsu with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It was in the early days before the term MMA even existed.
Yep.
You might say Vale Tudo, you might say no holds barred, but we don't actually have the term mixed martial arts. So I've seen the evolution of the sport. And there's no doubt that today's athletes are a different breed. We actually have true mixed martial artists.
We have weight classes now. There was no weight classes in the beginning.
Yeah, when we go back to the one man, 4 fights in a night tournament, no weight classes, no time limits. I mean, that's a different sport altogether. And if you look back, it was actually Royce Gracie's family who helped get involved because they were trying to showcase the effectiveness of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and taking the fight to the ground. At the time, Royce was probably the heir to the throne. He has other brothers, Rickson probably being the most famous to mixed martial arts fans who delve back into history. Rickson sported a record of approximately 100-0, but he was fighting mostly in Japan. Yep. So Royce was the heir apparent at the time. So this whole thing was designed to showcase Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And to North American audiences, they didn't know anything about the ground game. We only knew boxing. So when he would bring the fight to the ground, that was taking people out of their comfort zone and off land and into the water where they didn't know how to swim. And that's why the American wrestlers like Dan Severn, like Ken Shamrock, were actually the ones who were competing with Royce and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because they were used to fighting. And it actually played well because you had an American wrestler who's used to stacking up a guy on his back. You have Jiu-Jitsu where being on your back is an offensive position. So they actually fit right perfectly in like puzzle pieces for these matches. And at the time, most people didn't understand that. In fact, Senator John McCain, called it human cockfighting. People didn't understand the sport. It was a bloodbath, or it was something unruly. And so to John McCain's credit, he eventually came around and started to support it once we had weight classes, once we had rules. And some of the earlier ringside physicians, some of whom I'm still friendly with now, did a lot for the sport. And reaching out to the commissions, getting these things sanctioned was a huge, huge step in the right direction. So now we have a true sport. If you would say, what could I improve on the sport? I think we have a little bit of saturation. This product's a little diluted because we have so many fights now. When I was sort of in my prime of following it, it was when we had a couple pay-per-views a year, and each card was stacked from top to bottom. To me, that was a golden age of mixed martial arts. And I think we might have too many fights now, and so the product gets diluted. And also we need to make sure that we respect number one contenders and actually have people fight their way and not just get a title shot because, they talk really well or, they go out on social media and earn a number one shot that way. I think we really got to make sure that, at least if we're looking back towards boxing, they have a better way of working your way up the ranking system. And I think we need to respect that if we're going to keep the sport true to its name as a sport.
Yeah, and it's 100% grown from the time of just being tournament, no weight class, just go on, best man wins. And I got to say, 1993 was the first fight. I was a little young. I was born in 88, so I was 5 years old. I was really introduced to UFC through WWF because I liked WWF, and Ken Shamrock came, and he always had the octagon fights, and I thought that was awesome. And I slowly but surely started to discover what MMA was and what UFC was. And I remember seeing the Big Red Fist and Pride Fighting Champions. And that was like kind of my first introduction. And I really started to pay attention in high school. One of my buddies was a really, really talented wrestler. And he found this documentary that he fell in love with called The Smashing Machine, which I'm pretty sure you're probably familiar with. It was a story of Mark Kerr. And I watched it, and just the brutality of the early MMA UFC fights. And even when he went over to Pride, where Pride Fighting Championship in Japan, this was already happening in Japan a long time ago. And it was a much bigger market there. Very similar to what a lot of people have always wanted to see, where you're just putting the best fighters on the planet, the experts, up against each other. So it has that allure to it. My one major issue with it right now, and I think you touched on something with the saturation. We have the Ultimate Fighter, we have Bellator, we have all the UFC cards. We have so many different small promotions now doing things. My other issue is the scoring system. I hate that MMA uses a boxing style scoring system. I think it is a sport that is more apt to using your collegiate Greco-Roman style wrestling scoring system, where you are rewarded certain number points for certain things and not just an overall round card. How would you feel about something like that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've not heard that approach to it. I do agree that the 10-point must system is better suited to boxing, especially when it comes to things like aggression or octagon control. That's sometimes hard because if the guys are looking for knockouts and they're strikers, it sort of is leaned more towards their favor. Whereas opposed to a guy who's a slower technical jiu-jitsu guy, he's not going to be in the eyes of the judges necessarily the aggressor. So I do think that those nuances cater more towards the North American boxing audience. I think that's absolutely correct how you put that. I do like wrestling, and it's interesting. I was a team doc twice now for Team USA for freestyle wrestling. And to me, I'm really surprised that hasn't taken off in America.
It's so much fun to watch.
Yeah, it's now that people are into grappling, I almost wonder if we could bring out a freestyle wrestling federation, because most people will think about high school wrestling, and that's as far as they think about wrestling or amateur wrestling. But if you watch, I ask someone just go to YouTube and look at freestyle wrestling highlights, and you see guys doing suplexes, you see guys throwing people. It's a totally different sport than I think most people who are unfamiliar with freestyle wrestling understand. And so I agree that's probably closer for the grappling aspect, because it is mixed martial arts. So you do have the striking. So yeah, boxing, striking sport, that point system works. But you also have the grappling. And I agree, I don't think the grappling is as well represented. And maybe we do need to look towards wrestling to sort of value the grappling aspect of things.
I couldn't imagine seeing Jordan Burroughs on a main card in a freestyle just throwing people. Like, he would be an ultimate megastar with how dominant. And it's so sad that we talk about dominant athletes. We talk about your LeBrons, your Tigers. Jordan Burroughs might be one of the most dominant athletes of all time, and no one really knows who he is outside of Olympics. And it's really sad to see. But go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I was going to say, so Jordan won last year's World Cup. And so this year I was with the privilege of the next group of guys. They had the World Cup in Siberia of freestyle wrestling. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of guys up and coming too that are going to be pretty exciting. So I think it's a whole sort of team that most people aren't aware of. Fans will come up to them from other countries and want their autographs, yet most people, unless they're collegiate fans, don't know these guys in the U.S. And I'll tell you, they're tremendous athletes. But Jordan Burroughs is certainly a prime example of a very talented and very gifted athlete and a showman. And you talk about WWE, there's a lot of personalities in wrestling. And I think you could showcase that as well. And I think that, it's something that should be looked into. And I wanted to comment also when you talked about when you're getting into the UFC and you were talking about WWE, for me, a golden age was when we had Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, and Randy Couture. Just even looking at those guys, you had Tito Ortiz in his fire trunks. You had Iceman Chuck Liddell in his blue ice trunks. That to me was storylines like the WWE, but actual mixed martial arts competition. So I think try not to force storylines, because a lot of times I think guys are forcing storylines, but actually having the real storylines is going to help the UFC.
And I do have to put one little public service announcement out there for everyone, since we were talking about collegiate wrestling and stuff like that. During March Madness, there is Mat Madness that goes on, which is the college national championships. Take a minute from stop watching basketball and go watch that. It's actually more entertaining than most of those basketball games. I know it's blasphemy, but it's true. I think you watch Mat Madness when it comes around.
I do. I like to go to Flow Wrestling. I'll put a shout out to them. They're
Flows. They're all great. All those.
So I really like to watch those. And if anyone just wants to see highlights, of course you can go to YouTube. But every year in Las Vegas, there's the World Championships. These are to see who's going to go to the Olympics. Yep. And that's something that I think if you just want to watch one event, that's a pretty good one to watch.
Definitely. Now, I have to ask you, from a doctor's standpoint, orthopedic surgeon, you've obviously, you're passionate about it. You've worked on athletes, obviously, professional athletes. How has the sport of MMA, and there's been a lot more regulations and a lot more rules added, and concussions are such a big deal, and the football gets the brunt of it right now. Hockey is definitely on the cusp. We're starting to see the murmurs of hockey in the concussion conversation. It's going to go to soccer because of all the head balls. Boxing has kind of just been left to the back burner right now because everyone kind of is, it's not in the spotlight anymore. Maybe with the success of Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, it might get some more, but boxing's kind of passing the concussion thing. MMA, I feel like, might be in that crosshairs of talking about just major injuries, because the bottom line with the MMA, you're trying to injure your opponent. That's it. You're not necessarily trying to maim him like early MMA was. You're not trying to maim an opponent anymore or kill them, but you are trying to hurt them to the point where they submit or on the brink of breaking something. What has MMA done to educate everyone on the dangers and certain things of contact sports? And do you think that they are close to getting that kind of too violent to be a sport outrage type coming to them?
Yeah, I don't think they are in a position where they're going to be considered too violent. I think that era for MMA is past, and it's now well accepted as a sport. The challenge with concussions with MMA is the same with any sport. A lot of it's education. So, for instance, the fact that you don't need to be knocked out to get a concussion is sometimes news to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And so they don't realize that if I didn't get knocked out, I didn't get a concussion, or I got my bell wrong. Is that a concussion? There's other subtle signs like mood changes, forgetfulness, a lot of these other things that I think athletes need to be educated on. And if you mentioned my earlier book, and I have a whole section on concussions in my earlier book where I do interview other fighters.
Go ahead, Jonathan. Give that earlier book a plug. I want to hear what's the name of that book so everyone can go find that one before they read this one.
So that one's The Ultimate Guide to Preventing and Treating MMA Injuries. And with that one, I interviewed a lot of fighters, over 50 UFC and professional fighters, many of them Hall of Famers like Randy Couture, Bas Rutten, Pat Miletich. These guys have been in the sport and they've seen the progression. But even, current guys, and a lot of them, one in particular, Carlos Condit, I believe, is the one who told me how he was no longer sparring hard. And I've heard this from other people as well, that at a certain point, these guys know they're tough. They know how to take a punch. So to sit there and prove how tough you are by getting pounded in the head a bunch of times is not smart. And that's a bonus to those athletes who think ahead, who are realizing, and you're starting to see this with football. Maybe Andrew Luck is one example of somebody who said, you know what, my body is where I need it to be. I'm not going to hurt it anymore. I'm going to take a step back. Yeah. And so, with these sports, a lot of these injuries are happening in training, and a lot of these concussions are happening in training. And the truth is, you really don't need to go hard all the time, and maybe even any of the time. You just need to work on technique and strategy once you've reached that level. So that's certainly something that comes along with education and appreciation by the athlete, but also by the coach or the trainer who's monitoring them. And that's their job as well, is to protect their athlete. Just like we as ringside docs, people say, well, you're a doctor and you're watching someone get hurt, but our job is to try and mitigate or lessen that injury risk so that the athlete can come back another day. That's really what it is. And a lot of times you'll see some reactions in the cage. People will be angry that, a fight was called. But most of them, once the adrenaline is down and they've had a chance to get out of the spotlight, they realize that really, stopping fights was the best thing for them. The challenge we have is trying to diagnose a concussion. So obviously a KO you can see, but other things are more subtle. And, you might see some knock knees, or you might see a change of aggression. You might see the fighter stumble to a different corner. These are all things that the ringside doc and hopefully the referee are looking for as well, because a lot of damage doesn't necessarily happen with a big concussion, but there's something called subconcussion or subconcussive episodes where it's all these small things that build up over time. So a lot of it's trying to figure out what's the best way to limit the amount of head trauma, but still let the fight progress. And that's certainly a work in progress, no doubt about it.
So you talk like you've been a ringside doc. Have you been a ringside doc before?
Yeah, I'm actually part of a group called the Association of Ringside Physicians, which is a great group, a bunch of some of the best ringside docs in the nation, possibly in the world, are all part of this group. And our job is to protect athletes, but also to educate. And it's a great organization that I think is growing in importance.
First of all, that's amazing. And I think that's an awesome trade. I have to ask, what is the feeling when you see a guy get brutally knocked out? Does the adrenaline start going? What are your first reactions when you get into that cage? What is that mentality and that feeling?
Well, the first thing you do is you want to make sure that the athlete's well protected, because that's your job as the doc, is to protect the athlete. So, you try and have as much tunnel vision as you can to make sure you get to the athlete. You also have to be aware of the referee, the other fighter, the seconds, the cornermen, the fans. You want to make sure that you're aware of all that as well. So, most of the time, your job is just to make sure that nothing happens additionally to the fighter. Most of the time, fortunately, these knockouts, they look scary, but they come back and the immediate danger has passed. Now, we always observe the fighter, because most of the time, when you unfortunately hear about deaths in the ring, it's not from an acute injury. And if even we can relate this back to Dooku Kim in our book, Dooku Kim, he dies from a brain bleed, but not right away. It takes some time. And so really we got to monitor the athletes, and not so much the acute right away. We got to protect them. That's pretty straightforward. It's the monitoring. It's making sure they have appropriate follow-up and making sure they're being observed. Those are the things that help prevent tragedies.
Jonathan, you sound cool as a cucumber, so I would definitely want you as a guy working on me if I get knocked out.
Yeah, it's funny because every doc's a little different. So I'm an ortho doc, so I like broken bones and dislocations better. But yeah, each of us have our own subspecialties, but we all try to do our best to make sure the athlete's safe.
I've had 2 ankle surgeries and a jaw surgery, so I know there's some orthos, they just enjoy playing around with broken bones. I have to ask you, who is your current favorite fighter, male or female, to watch currently in the UFC, Bellator, or wherever right now?
That's a really hard question. I think
that's what I do.
Yeah, there's a lot of fighters. I like Khabib. Obviously, he's a great fighter.
Yeah.
I don't like a lot of the things that went down with Conor and that whole thing. So, I'm one of the guys that likes fighters, but I like the professional. The guys that they hate each other, but once that fight's over, you hug your bros. You've survived playing together. That's what I like to see. So I like his talent, but really turned off by all the shenanigans after the fights.
Okay. And last question I have to ask you. Boxing has been the superior North American sport, and it's still in the box office compared to UFC, like dwarfs the UFC. Are we going to see a time where, whether it's a UFC or any other MMA production, will drive in a bigger number in the box office in a pay-per-view than boxing will.
You know, I think we've seen that people like Conor McGregor can basically get the hype machine to get the dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's certainly possible. The thing with MMA is the guys fight more often. Now they're starting to fight less and less often, and so you're starting to get to that boxing scenario where a guy might not fight for a year or two, and when he does, he's going to get a big payday. I think that can happen. I just don't think that's the nature of MMA. I think because of the way the fights are, I think fighters should be able to fight more often, and I think they should. I don't think they should be like Cowboy Cerrone and trying to fight as many times as possible just to reach that number, because
He's awesome.
yeah, he's entertaining, but I worry about his future. But I can respect that, what he's trying to go for. But as a doctor, I've got to take pause and counsel him against that. But I don't know if MMA should do that. I think they could, but I think the sport needs more frequent fights, and especially we see these guys. We have interim champs, and you have guys changing the weight class and never returning. So that really hurts the sport, I think. So while that has worked for boxing, I'm not sure that would work for MMA.
I think a major value that MMA, UFC specifically, has on boxing is UFC is recognized as the major body, where in boxing there's like 6 major bodies. So I think that definitely helps, where there's one kind of league of fighters as opposed to a world of fighters spread out amongst a bunch of different boxing organizations.
Yeah, I mean, the alphabet soup of boxing federations has always been an issue. Recognizing champs being one of them. The other one's regulation. So when you're dealing with commissions, you're dealing with docs, having so many different federations has also made it a challenge. And we have that problem with mixed martial arts, because even though the UFC is the main sort of body of the sport, they're not a governing body. Each state sanctions the fights, and each state assigns the ringside docs usually. And it's the states that decide the rules of the contest. And so while the UFC does have that aspect where it is the sort of preeminent athlete roster, it's really not where the rules are made. And so if the UFC can work with the commissions, then that will make things easier. A lot of these stories actually harken back to the NFL. So I have a mentor who was one of the first team docs for the NFL, and he sees a lot of parallels with how MMA is now with what the NFL was in the 70s, before they brought on the team physicians in a regular role, before they got all these advisory boards. And that was because the NFL was a central body. And so the UFC, we have a central body with a large roster. And so if we can work with them as commissions and ringside docs, then it's a lot easier to work with one organization, as long as they're willing to talk, than it is, 5 or 6 different organizations.
Yeah, that definitely has to get fixed up in context, like, well, martial arts sports in general, when it comes to fighting sports. They need to fix that. It needs to stop being a states thing, because that sounds ridiculous. We're going to switch topics, though. You are a New York, New Jersey sports fan like myself, and I'm sorry to hear that, because we had glory days, but they seem to be far behind a lot of our franchises. I have to ask you, what is your favorite memory as a New York sports fan?
I mean, the one that jumps out in my mind as probably the most amazing and unexpected was when the Giants beat the Patriots, especially because I'm not a Patriots fan.
No one should be.
Right.
I'm a Jets fan, so I can't stand them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's funny. Like, most of my family who's from New Jersey are Jets and Mets. And then my family that is New York are Yankees and Giants. So I've fallen on the Yankees and Giants side of things. And that team, I never, at first I didn't like Eli Manning, especially with the whole thing where he was drafted by San Diego and refused to play and was immediately traded to the Giants.
Yep.
It had put a bad taste in my mouth. And so it took some time for me to like Eli. But I think he grew into a role player. And I think, that game, he and David Tyree and the rest of the players, they really played. They're clearly the underdogs. And on any other day, they most likely would have lost. But they put together a game that day that was unexpected, but brilliant. And so that was probably one of my favorite moments as a New York fan.
So fun story about that. And like I said, I'm a Jets fan. So Giants, there's kind of no love lost for the Giants, but I'm not against seeing them win. I'm against hearing their fans after they win. But when it came to that season, the Giants were doing good. They had, they were still not getting respect, but anyone that was around me, if they remember, people are going to think I'm homering right now, but seriously, I'm not. I said, if there is any team that can stop the Patriots, because the Patriots were on a run and they were playing well, and they were obviously going to probably get there, them or Peyton and the Colts. It was usually a two-man race. And I said, if any team can win the championship in the NFC and get to the Pats, it's going to be the Giants. And I got laughed at because I think at the time they were like 5-4. They were not doing well. And I'm like, listen, they have a pass rush. They can run, and Eli is good enough. And lo and behold, he did that not once, but twice to Tom Brady. So I think that's a great sports memory for Giants fans to have. As a Jets fan, I wasn't alive in '68, so I don't have a great Jets sports memory.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I don't have one either. But yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that you called that when you did, because I'm not sure I would have been calling that even as a Giants fan.
Yeah, a lot of Giants fans looked at me and told me I was nuts. They thought their season was over. Eli sucks, this and that. It is what it is. He's obviously, Eli, no one likes Eli anymore now that Daniel Jones is officially starting. So we'll see how that goes. Now, speaking of Daniel Jones officially starting, Giants have their Super Bowls, but lately they've been terrible. Jets have been bad. Yankees have been good. They're expected to at least compete for the championship, but they had a lull. Mets are the Mets. I'm a Brooklyn Nets fan. They haven't been good. Knicks are awful. Even in hockey, there hasn't been much well. The Islanders were okay. We had a few Stanley Cup appearances, nothing great. I don't consider Buffalo New York, so they're out of here. How can the New York teams ever get back on track? It seems like New England took all of the championships from New York and just stole them all and just keeps them in the Boston, New England area. Can you see New York ever getting back on track as being like a championship city?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. And it's funny because for the longest time when I was growing up, and I'm not that much older, I was born in '80,
Okay.
so a decade over you, but for the longest time, the Boston fans would whine and complain about how the Yankees buy pennants and
They still do.
and right, but still, like Boston, they've been winning the championships, so they have no more rights to complain. Like
No.
that ship has sailed. But I did really like the Knicks with Patrick Ewing and Charles Oakley and John Starks and an amazing sixth man, Anthony Mason. And I think the Knicks have been struggling to find that composition again. Carmelo, I don't think really worked out, and I think the Knicks they bank too much on getting a player that was going to be a star that didn't become a star, and they've had a bunch of hard luck since then. I think they really need to find the right franchise player, and you make better trade picks or draft picks, and then find the right coach too, because we had some great coaches, Pat Riley, Van Gundy. These guys knew how to use those players in their roles, and I think that's a big thing with New York is they've always had very good role players when they were good. Patrick was a star center, Hall of Famer, but everybody else on that team, they played a role and they played it well, even down to the sixth man. And I bring up Anthony Mason because he was the sixth man of the year. And so they didn't have five players, they had six, that were regular and playing the role. And so I think that's how they got to build, because they got to fill all the positions. And it's hard in this day and age because most of the teams now, and that may be why they're not as good as they used to be, is it's not a team sport as much as it is building around a star like LeBron. So the Knicks they can't do that. They've never been successful doing that. So I think the only way they're going to get back on track is to go back to that filling a roster of players mentality.
Good news for Knicks fans. I think they are doing that. I think they have a lot of good role players. We'll see what RJ Barrett can become if he's a superstar. I'm hoping my Nets are a lot better than the Knicks. That's all I got to say, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, they've come a long way, the Nets, no doubt about that. It's like since moving to Brooklyn, it's like a whole new team.
It is. And it's sad to say a lot of the New Jersey fans kind of jumped ship when they went to Brooklyn, and I think are either with Philly or the Knicks, and now they're not welcome back. We don't want you guys back. We want a new young generation of Brooklyn fans, and hopefully Kyrie, Kevin Durant, and success will bring that. That's the hopes. But all right, Jonathan, with that will close out this episode of the Sports Opinions Podcast. I really appreciate you coming on.
No, thanks. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Again, that is Jonathan Gelber. He is the author of the brand new book coming out October 1st. It is Tiger Woods' Back and Tommy John's Elbow, Injuries and Tragedies That Transform Career, Sports, and Society. Jonathan, is there any plugs, any social media outlets, or any way people can find you that you want them to?
Sure. I do have a Twitter. It's at Jonathan Gelber, JONATHANGELB like boy, ER. I'm also, my website, you can email me through my website. It's drjohn.gelber.com. And of course, reaching out. And if you do buy the books, reviewing them on Amazon is a great way to get the word out. So if anybody does buy a book off Amazon, or even if you don't, put in a review, put in a plug. It helps to get the word out, and more people are going to benefit by reading this book.
Definitely go read the book and go get it. And don't just put a fake review. Read the damn book. But anyway, again, I'm Alex Cuesta. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at @_Cuesta30. Find Sports Opinions on Twitter at SportsOpinion30. Instagram, Sports Opinions 30. Visit the Facebook page. Listen to this anywhere you can get a podcast, and give it a good review and rating. Again, everybody, was the Sports Opinions podcast. Have a good one, everybody.